Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm your host Vanessa and I'm delighted you joined me for what might be our most overdue literary correction. Before we dive in, grab yourself a cup of tea if you can. I'm enjoying a gentle chamomile, and there's something fitting about a quietly powerful tea as we explore the work of the Brontë sister who's been overshadowed, dismissed, and underestimated for far too long. If you've been listening to my last few episodes, you'll know that for Women's History Month in March, I've been focusing on women's British literature in particular, and that means I get to do what I love most, shine a light on the women writers who shaped the literary world, often against incredible odds, and who don't always get the recognition they deserve. And honestly, no family embodies that story better than the Brontës. We've talked about Charlotte, we've talked about Emily, but today we are finally giving the third Brontë sister her moment in the spotlight. The one who is so often overshadowed, so frequently forgotten, and yet, when you actually sit down with her work, you realize she might have been the boldest one of them all. I'm talking about Anne Brontë, and friends, she has been waiting long enough. We've explored Emily's passionate intensity in Wuthering Heights, and Charlotte's revolutionary heroine in Jane Eyre. Today, we're meeting the youngest Brontë sister, Anne, whose novels are just as brilliant, just as radical, and in some ways even more courageous than her sister's work. But Anne has been called the forgotten Brontë, dismissed as the least talented sister, the one who wrote quieter, less interesting books. Here's what I want you to understand today. Anne Brontë was arguably the most radical writer in her family. She wrote about subjects that were considered absolutely taboo in Victorian society: domestic violence, alcoholism, women's right to leave abusive marriages. And she did it not with Gothic atmosphere or romantic passion, but with unflinching realism that made her work even more disturbing to Victorian readers. Anne's second novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was so controversial that even Charlotte suppressed its republication after Anne's death, believing it was too shocking and unpleasant for the public. But modern readers recognize it as a pioneering feminist novel that addresses issues we're still grappling with today. So let's return to Haworth Parsonage and meet the youngest, quietest, and perhaps bravest of the Brontë sisters. Anne Brontë was born in 1820, the youngest of the 6 Brontë children. She was only a year old when her mother died, and she barely remembered her 2 oldest sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, who died when Anne was just 5. This meant Anne grew up essentially as the youngest of 4, with Charlotte, Branwell, and Emily as her siblings and surrogate parents. In the family dynamic, Anne was often seen as the baby, the gentle one, the most conventional. Charlotte later described her as a very sincere and practical Christian who was naturally sensitive, reserved, and dejected. This description has shaped how people think about Anne as quiet, modest, somewhat timid compared to her more dramatic sisters. But this image is deeply misleading. Yes, Anne was gentler in manner than Emily's intensity or Charlotte's fiery temperament. But gentle manner doesn't mean weak conviction. Anne was actually the toughest and most pragmatic of the sisters, the one most capable of dealing with harsh realities. She was the only Brontë sister who held down a job for more than a few months. She worked as a governess for 2 different families for a total of about 5 years, enduring loneliness, homesickness, and the peculiar humiliations of the governess position. Charlotte tried being a governess and couldn't stand it. Emily literally made herself ill and had to come home, but Anne stuck it out, sending money home to help the family. Her experiences as a governess gave her intimate knowledge of how Victorian families actually functioned behind closed doors. The neglected children, the tyrannical fathers, the manipulative mothers, the spoiled heirs. She saw things that Charlotte and Emily only imagined. Most significantly, Anne worked for the Robinson family at Thorpe Green Hall from 1840 to 1845, and she brought her brother Branwell to work there as a tutor. This decision would have tragic consequences. Branwell, always unstable, became involved with Mrs. Robinson and was eventually dismissed. The scandal destroyed him. He descended into alcoholism and opium addiction, dying at age 31 in 1848. Anne watched her beloved brother destroy himself. She nursed him through his worst episodes, saw how alcohol and addiction transformed someone she loved into someone unrecognizable. This experience would profoundly shape her second novel. But Anne was also deeply religious in ways her sisters weren't. She struggled with questions about salvation and damnation, worried about whether she and her siblings would be saved. Unlike Emily's pantheistic nature worship or Charlotte's more emotional Christianity, Anne developed a thoughtful, questioning faith that rejected the harsh Calvinist doctrine of the predestination she'd been taught. This theological independence shows up in her novels. She argued that everyone could be saved through repentance and reform, that God was loving rather than vengeful, that women had souls and moral agency equal to men. These were controversial theological positions that challenged established church teachings. Anne published 2 novels, Agnes Grey in 1847 and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall in 1848. Agnes Grey was published in the same volume as Emily's Wuthering Heights, and it was largely overshadowed by Emily's more dramatic work. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was actually a bestseller. It sold better initially than Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, but it was also savagely attacked by critics as coarse, brutal, and morally offensive. Anne died of tuberculosis in May 1849 at only 29 years old. She was the second of the last of the siblings to die after Branwell, Emily, and eventually Charlotte. Charlotte, as Anne's literary executor, made the decision not to allow The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be reprinted, believing it was too painful and too controversial. This decision consigned Anne to literary obscurity for decades. Let's talk about Agnes Grey, Anne's first novel. Agnes Grey, Anne's first novel, draws directly on her experiences as a governess. It's often dismissed as a minor work, overshadowed by Jane Eyre, which came out the same year, and also featured a governess heroine. But Agnes Grey does something different from Jane Eyre. It strips away the Gothic atmosphere and romantic plot to show the governess life with stark realism. Agnes is the daughter of a clergyman whose family has fallen into financial difficulty. She insists on becoming a governess to help support them, despite her parents' reluctance. What follows is a detailed, unglamorous portrait of what that life actually entailed. Agnes's first position is with the Bloomfield family, whose children are spoiled, cruel, and completely undisciplined. The parents undermine Agnes's authority. The children torture animals for fun, and Agnes is blamed for her inability to control them. When she tries to stop a young boy from torturing a nest of baby birds, she's treated as if she's the problem, not the child's sadism. This is radically different from how governesses usually appeared in Victorian novels. They were typically either saintly figures who reform wild children through love and patience, or romantic heroines who marry their employers. Agnes is neither. She's a competent professional trying to do her job while being systemically disrespected and undermined. Her second position is with the Murray family, who are wealthier and more sophisticated but equally problematic. The teenage daughters, Rosalie and Matilda, are being raised to catch wealthy husbands through manipulation and flirtation. Agnes is supposed to teach them accomplishments and proper behavior while watching them practice cruelty and deception. Rosalie Murray is a particularly fascinating, beautiful, charming, and completely amoral. She flirts with the local curate, Mr. Weston, whom Agnes secretly loves, not because she's interested in him, but simply to prove she can attract any man. She eventually marries a wealthy lord who turns out to be a brutal drunk, trapping her in a miserable marriage she made for social position. Anne shows how Victorian society's emphasis on marriage as women's only career created women who were trained to be manipulative and deceptive, who viewed men as prizes to be won rather than partners to be known. The system damaged everyone involved. The novel's quiet radicalism is in its insistence on the dignity of work and the importance of moral character over social position. Agnes is poor, powerless, and socially insignificant, but she's also honest, hardworking, and morally serious. The wealthy families she works for have every social advantage, but are spiritually and morally bankrupt. Agnes eventually marries Mr. Weston, the curate, after he's been given a small parish. It's not a dramatic, romantic climax. It's 2 people of modest means and genuine character finding each other and building a quiet life based on shared values. This ending suggests that true happiness comes from moral compatibility and honest work, not from wealth or social position. The novel's restraint is itself a form of realism. Anne refuses to dramatize or romanticize. She just shows what governess life was actually like, the isolation, the social ambiguity, the constant small humiliations, the emotional labor of teaching children whose parents have given you no real authority. Now let's talk about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Anne's second novel. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is the book that proves Anne was potentially the most radical Brontë. Published in 1848, it tells the story of Helen Graham, a mysterious young widow who moves to Wildfell Hall with her young son and refuses to explain her past. She's pursued by Gilbert Markham, a local farmer, who eventually reads her diary and learns her shocking history. Helen isn't actually a widow. She's a runaway wife. She fled her husband, Arthur Huntingdon, taking their son with her and supporting herself by selling her paintings under her maiden name. This was virtually unthinkable in Victorian society. The legal situation was stark. Married women had no rights to their children, no right to their own property or earnings, no legal identity separate from their husbands. A woman who left her husband could be forced to return, could have her children taken away, and would be completely cut off from respectable society. So Helen's actions are incredibly courageous and borderline illegal. And Anne makes clear that Helen isn't leaving because of some dramatic single incident. She's leaving because her husband is an alcoholic and an adulterer who's corrupting their young son. She's protecting her child from learning his father's vices. The most shocking part of the novel is the middle section, where we read Helen's diary describing her marriage to Arthur Huntingdon. Anne shows in excruciating detail how an initially charming man gradually reveals himself to be selfish, dissipated, and cruel. Arthur isn't physically violent, though his friend Hargrave does attempt to assault Helen. His cruelty is more insidious. He drinks constantly, brings his mistresses to their home, ridicules Helen's religious faith, and deliberately tries to teach their son to drink and curse to spite her. He treats marriage as a prison for Helen, and a license for himself to do whatever he wants. What's extraordinary is Anne's unflinching realism about alcoholism and its effects. She'd watched her brother Branwell destroy himself with alcohol and opium, and she knew exactly how addiction worked. The promises to reform, the temporary improvements, the inevitable relapses, the way it warps personality and moral judgment. Victorian literature typically treated alcoholism as either comic, the jovial drunk, or a simple moral failing that could be overcome with willpower. Anne shows it as a progressive disease that destroys the drinker and everyone around them. This was decades ahead of modern understanding of addiction. She also challenges the Victorian romantic notion that a good woman's love could reform a bad man. Helen marries Arthur, partly believing she can change him. She can't. He gets progressively worse, and her suffering doesn't inspire him to reform. It just gives him someone to blame for his unhappiness. This was a direct rebuke to countless Victorian novels, where the heroine's patience and devotion eventually reforms the rake or the drunk. Anne says clearly, this is a dangerous fantasy. Some men don't reform, and women shouldn't sacrifice themselves, hoping for transformation that never comes. When Arthur finally becomes terminally ill, Helen returns to nurse him, not because she forgives him or believes in wifely duty, but because she's terrified he'll die unsaved and be damned. Even this religious motivation is complicated. Arthur doesn't have a deathbed conversion. He dies apparently unrepentant and possibly unsaved. This rejection of comforting religious conventions was shocking. Victorian readers expected deathbed conversions and divine justice. Anne offers neither. She shows that some people remain morally unchanged, and we can't know for certain what happens to their souls. After Arthur's death, Helen is free to marry Gilbert Markham, who loves her genuinely. But Anne makes this reunion difficult and realistic. Gilbert has to overcome his jealousy and pride. Helen has to learn to trust a man again after her disastrous first marriage. Their relationship is tested by misunderstanding and social prejudice. The novel's structure is also innovative. It begins with Gilbert's first-person narration, shifts to Helen's diary, which he reads without permission, raising questions about privacy and male entitlement, and returns to Gilbert's perspective. This creates multiple viewpoints on the same events and raises questions about who gets to tell women's stories. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a bestseller initially, but critical response was savage. Reviewers called it utterly unfit to be put into the hands of girls, coarse and disagreeable, and a morbid tale of wickedness. The problem wasn't that the novel was poorly written. Critics acknowledge Anne's skill. The problem was the subject matter. Anne had written about alcoholism, adultery, and domestic abuse, with unflinching realism. She'd shown a wife leaving her husband and being morally justified in doing so. She'd suggested that some marriages were beyond saving, and that women had the right to protect themselves and their children. This was heresy in Victorian society, which viewed marriage as sacred and indissoluble, except in extreme cases. The idea that a woman could judge her husband's behavior and take unilateral action based on that judgment challenged male authority at its foundation. Even more shocking, Anne didn't present Helen as tragically suffering or nobly sacrificing. Helen is angry, judgmental, and determined to save herself and her son. She's not waiting for male rescue or divine intervention. She's taking action herself. Charlotte's decision to suppress the novel after Anne's death was complicated. Charlotte claimed she was protecting Anne's reputation and sparing readers unnecessary painful material. But Charlotte also seemed genuinely troubled by the novel's content. She called it an entire mistake in her biographical notice of her sisters. Some scholars suggest that Anne was also protecting family privacy. The character of Arthur Huntingdon was clearly based on Branwell, and Charlotte may have wanted to avoid public discussion of her brother's addictions and failures. Whatever Charlotte's motivations, the effect was to consign Anne to literary obscurity. While Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights were continuously reprinted and discussed, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall virtually disappeared. When it was finally republished, it was often presented as a minor curiosity rather than a radical masterpiece it actually is. Modern feminist literary criticism has dramatically reassessed Anne's work, recognizing her as potentially the most radical voice in Victorian literature on women's rights and domestic abuse. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall addresses issues that remain urgently relevant. How do women leave abusive marriages? How do they protect their children? How does society treat women who refuse to stay with destructive partners? What rights should women have in marriage? Anne's realistic portrayal of alcoholism and its effects on families anticipates modern understandings of addiction as a family disease. Her refusal to romanticize the alcoholic or suggest love can cure addiction shows sophisticated understanding of these dynamics. Her challenge to the love reforms the rake trope speaks to contemporary discussions about women staying in dangerous relationships, hoping their partners will change. Anne's message that change must come from the person themselves, not from their partner's patience, remains important. The novel's exploration of economic dependence and how it traps women in bad marriages connects to ongoing discussions about women's financial autonomy. Helen can only leave Arthur because she has a small inheritance and can earn money from painting. Economic independence is crucial to her freedom. Anne's work has been increasingly recognized and celebrated. Major new editions, biographies, and critical studies have appeared. Literary tourism now includes Anne alongside her sisters. She's finally getting recognition as a major Victorian novelist rather than just the forgotten third sister. All right, and of course, I've got some great book recommendations for you today. For Understanding Anne, Samantha Ellis's Take Courage, Anne Brontë, and Art After Life is an excellent modern biography that argues for Anne's importance. Nick Holland's In Search of Anne Brontë traces her life and work with particular attention to the governess experiences. For her novels, the Penguin Classics editions of both Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall have excellent introductions and notes. For critical analysis, Juliet Barker's comprehensive The Brontës includes detailed discussion of Anne's work and its reception. For feminist perspectives, Elizabeth Langland's Anne Brontë, The Other One, makes the case for Anne as the most feminist Brontë. For comparative reading, read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall alongside Gaskell's Ruth to see how Victorian women writers approached fallen women and social transgression differently. Thank you for joining me on this overdue appreciation of Anne Brontë. I hope I've convinced you that she deserves to be remembered not just as the forgotten sister or the lesser Brontë, but as a courageous writer who tackled subjects more controversial than anything her sisters attempted. Thanks so much for listening to the Brit Lit Book Club. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave a review. It truly helps us reach more British literature lovers just like you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at The Book Club Tour and head to our website, thebookclubtour.com, to see upcoming book club tours. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.